Hello everyone, welcome to Eye on Africa. Here are your headlines on this Friday evening. 7 of the 8 Guinean opposition leaders in court on insurrection charges could face up to 5 years in prison. The prosecutor in the case has said it was seeking the maximum possible jail term for the men who called for protests against President Alpha Conde's push for constitutional reforms. The descendants of survivors of the first genocide of the 20th century are suing Germany in a New York City court. We'll explain how the Herero and Nama people of Namibia are seeking reparations from their former colonizer more than a century after the massacre. Also coming up, how researchers in the Ivory Coast are working to eliminate sleeping sickness. As many as 1,000 new cases are reported each year, but a lack of surveillance of the disease has led to a rise in infections. But first, the prosecutor in the trial of 8 Guinean opposition leaders has said he was seeking the maximum sentences of 5 years in prison for 7 of the 8 accused. The defendants were arrested on Saturday and charged with making statements that disturbed public order by calling for demonstrations against President Alpha Conde. The prosecutor has asked for the 8th defendant to be released. Conde is currently pushing for constitutional reforms, which critics say aim to let him run for a 3rd term. The court is expected to issue a verdict on Tuesday. While leaving today's hearing, the lawyer for the defendants told journalists his clients were just exercising their constitutional rights.
La défense unanimement a démontré que dans cette
The defense
affaire,
showed that in this case, there were no maneuvers or acts to harm the security of the Republic,
tendant à troubler la sécurité ou l'ordre public.
for the simple reason that in accordance with Article 21 of the Constitution, the right to resistance to oppression is constitutional.
À l'oppression est constitutionnel.
Next, it's considered by historians as the first genocide of the 20th century, the massacre of the Herero and Nama people by colonialists in German Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia. Since the country gained its independence in 1990, the descendants of the genocide have been seeking reparations from Germany. Well, 2 years ago, after failing to make much progress, they filed a lawsuit against Germany in New York City. Why New York? While the claimants argue that human skulls sold by Germany to the American Museum of Natural History in the Big Apple can be traced back to that genocide, and that Germany used the profits from that sale to buy property in New York, which would mean the case can be heard by a U.S. judge. Well, France 24's Jessica Lemazurier and Céline Bruno have this report.
These Herero tribespeople have flown from Namibia to New York in pursuit of justice for the tens of thousands massacred in their homeland over a century ago.
It's about us making sure that Germany does not get away with murder. So Germany can run, but they cannot hide.
An estimated 85,000 Herero and Nama people were killed under German colonial rule between 1904 and 1908. Berlin's acknowledged the genocide and is negotiating with Namibia to combine an official apology with a fund. But the victims' descendants feel excluded from those talks. After the discovery of Herero's skulls in the American Museum of Natural History 2 years ago, they filed a compensation suit here in New York.
Some of the bones of the victims were actually sold by Germany to the American Museum of Natural History here in New York. So we say the bones of those victims really cry out for justice in U.S. courts in this district in New York, since their remains and buildings purchased by Germany with profits from the genocide are here in New York.
Germany says the suit has no place in a U.S. court.
The United States is not the International Court of Justice in The Hague. This is a U.S. court, and that's what the question is under U.S. law, does this court have jurisdiction to hear the case?
American Namibian scholar Kavemui Murangi feels a personal connection to the case and to the remains in the American Museum of Natural History.
Could be any one of our relatives. I know that my great-grandfather and his wife, they died during the genocide. We do not know where the remains are.
If the judge does not grant jurisdiction, these Herero say they'll take their struggle to the US Supreme Court.
At least 28 people have been killed and hundreds forced to flee from their homes after devastating floods in Ghana. The 8 days of torrential rain have also led to the collapse of nearly 300 houses. Relief items are currently being transported by road from the capital, Accra, some 800 kilometers away, but meteorologists warn heavy rain could last into next month. Flooding has already killed 46 people in Ghana so far this year. Mozambique's National Electoral Commission has released very partial results of the presidential, parliamentary, and provincial polls held on Tuesday. Those incomplete results show President Filipe Nyusi and his ruling Frelimo party heading for a dominant victory, winning 75% of the more than 800,000 ballots already counted. But the lopsided nature of partial results could revive fears over the country's fragile peace deal. Observers from the U.S. Embassy say they had witnessed voting irregularities on Tuesday. Meanwhile, the EU Commission says they condemn the general atmosphere in which the vote took place.
Although on election day we did not experience major shortcomings, preparations for the elections have once again been challenging, conducted on a level playing field and a source of contention. The lead up to these elections witnesses violence, intimidation, and even murders, including the one of a leading figure of the Mozambique's election observation community, Mr. Anastasio Matabel. We strongly condemn such acts, and those responsible should be brought to justice.
Guillaume Soro, the former leader of the Ivory Coast National Assembly and now an opposition member, has said he will be running for president in 2020. In an interview with France 24 and our sister radio station RFI, Soro said he would make a solemn and official statement when he returns to the Ivory Coast. The former ally of President Alassane Ouattara is not supported by any of the three main parties. Instead, he has decided to launch a movement called Génération et Peuple Solidaire, similar to the En Marche movement of French President Emmanuel Macron. But as he explained to our very own Mark Perelman, he has some doubts over the fairness of the upcoming election. Take a listen.
Last week, the Independent Electoral Commission was established, and I am concerned. I fear for the stability of Ivory Coast and for the peace in the country. Allow me to paraphrase French President Jacques Chirac. May he rest in peace. Everyone knows that this Independent Electoral Commission is bribed and follows orders. Everyone knows that this Independent Electoral Commission will burn Ivory Coast. And everyone pretends not to see it. You all look away.
The World Health Organization is calling it a triumph for public health. On Friday, the European Medicines Agency said it had recommended a conditional marketing authorization in the EU for Ervebo, the only Ebola vaccine currently in circulation. The European Commission now has to make a decision on an EU-wide marketing authorization. The vaccine has been tested on about 16,000 people in clinical studies in Africa, Europe, and the US, and has proven to be safe and effective. And since the start of the latest outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo, more than 236,000 people have also received the vaccine. Finally tonight, about 1,000 new cases of sleeping sickness are reported each year, all of them in sub-Saharan Africa. The deadly parasitic disease is spread by the tsetse fly. As of now, many cases are believed to go undiagnosed and unreported, and a lack of surveillance has led to a rise in infection, as observed in Guinea following the Ebola outbreak. But researchers in the Ivory Coast are currently working to eliminate the disease, as Pierre Del Rio explains.
At the Pierre Richer Institute in Bouaké, Ivory Coast, the team of researchers have one deadline in mind.
The objective concerning the African trypanosomiasis is to completely eliminate it by 2020 as a public health issue. And we're aiming to end transmission of the disease by 2030.
African trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness, is endemic in 36 sub-Saharan African countries where tsetse flies can be found, presenting a risk for some 70 million people. In the last 70 years, over 70% of reported cases occurred in the Democratic Republic of Congo, here in red. Neighboring countries in orange have reported far less contamination. In countries in yellow, no recent cases at all. The disease mainly affects poor rural areas and is on the list of the WHO's neglected tropical diseases.
The disease is one of the neglected tropical diseases, which mainly affect the most vulnerable people, who are often, unfortunately, also the least financially solvent people, and therefore do not attract much interest from donors or the pharmaceutical industry.
In its earlier stages, the disease is curable, causing bouts of fever, headaches, joint pains, and itching. As it crosses from the bloodstream to the brain, infecting the nervous system, it can cause changes of behavior, confusion, as well as disturbance of the sleep cycle, which gives the disease its nickname. Without treatment, sleeping sickness is considered fatal.
Well, that does it for this edition of Eye on Africa. Coming up, Live from Paris continues with Charlie James. That's right after this short break. Stay with us.